This is the Lowdown Livestream with the things that matter to Kent.
So today's big topic is how should we be protecting our MPs following the death of Sir David Amess? It was a news which shocked us all on Friday afternoon when the news broke that Leigh-on-Sea MP David Amess had been fatally stabbed and subsequently died. It comes 5 years after the murder of Jo Cox, another MP who was shot and stabbed in West Yorkshire shortly before attending a surgery herself. So, of course, people are once again talking about the safety of our MPs in their constituencies. How safe actually are they? How far does this abuse go to other public service workers as well? And what can be done about it realistically? So I'm going to be talking about all of this and a lot more with some very special guests today. And just a reminder, if you want to get involved, comments on the socials and we'll try and get to them as we do. So today we have Mr. Paul Francis, KM's political editor and favourite on the show. You are. So we also have Karen Constantine, who's a Labour councillor for Kent County Council. How are you doing, Karen?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good. And we have Claire Nelson, who is the Sevenoaks Conservative councillor. How are you doing, Claire?
Hi, good, thank you.
Paul, obviously this has been, a story which has shaken Westminster, shaken the rest of the country. Describe kind of the reaction to this as it broke on Friday.
Well, I think people just couldn't reconcile themselves to what had happened for some time. It was an absolute shocking way of killing someone, and I just think that people have had to spend some time reconciling what they saw and what was reported, and I think that's been very difficult for a lot of people, and for particularly MPs who were perhaps doing their own constituency surgeries at the very time this was going on.
Yeah, and I want to kind of push that question out to both of the councillors that we have on the show today. Karen, I'll start with you. And what were the reactions to the circles that you work in and the people that you speak to on a daily basis? What were people thinking when this kind of broke?
I think, again, it was just total and utter shock, a kind of absolute sense of disbelief, and then obviously not really being sure what had happened. But, I think we all do come together when we recognise something as a completely senseless attack on another, valuable member of our community. It's just completely senseless. And I don't mind telling you, I started to cry because it was just so shocking, and it's so sad. And obviously my heart goes out to his family and to his colleagues, and also the people that were involved in that attack. I mean, that's going to take a lot of time to get over, and this is an affront to democracy as well. It's very simple to say that.
And Claire, the other thing I suppose about this is it's only, and I mentioned it in the introduction, it's only 5 years since we had what happened to Jo Cox as well. And so people will still be healing from that happening. And so for it to happen again so soon, I suppose that makes the impact all the heavier.
Yes, it does. And I think everybody has that in mind. And as Karen has just rightly said, it's the families who will have an enormous hole left in their lives, but also the staff that work with the MP. They will find this incredibly hard. And I've seen some really, really touching tributes from people on social media saying, let's be kind, let's look at the family. They want to read happy thoughts. And for once, social media was absolutely flooded with the most beautiful stories that made you smile and sort of cry a little at the same time, but just brought out the essence of the person. Because what we can't ever, fail to remember is this was a man doing his job. He left home in the morning, he said goodbye to his family, and he didn't come home. And that really, really can't happen again.
Karen, you mentioned earlier about the fact that there's a lot of here, and the reactions that we've seen in the House today as well have kind of transcended political lines. I suppose this is the kind of thing, when this happens, the partisan politics gets put to the side and everyone comes together to not only just pay tribute but maybe talk about a solution to a problem.
I think party politics have to be set to one side. I think we have to accept that this is a massive tragedy. It has an impact on all of us, because this is a threat to democracy. Also, if MPs can't go about their business, if we have to start putting in, incredible steps to encourage safety and protection, then that's going to hamper how MPs work. So I don't think there's no really good news in this, is there? I mean, it is a terrible attack, and we've somehow got to get to grips with how we deal with this going forward. And I think there's got to be greater monitoring of social media. I think where threats are made or veiled threats are made, they're going to have to be taken more seriously. And MPs are going to have to think about how they operate, because we don't want a repetition of this. It's literally too awful for words.
And this, of course, this topic, has brought up the issue of security for MPs, as you mentioned there, people thinking about how they work in their constituencies and how they interact with the public. But it should be said also that this is sort of a reiteration of the debate that ended up happening after what happened to Joe Cox. I mean, Paul, did anything actually really come of that initially? Because we've had these conversations about MP security in the past. And I mean, I don't really think a great deal has changed since 2016, has it?
Not in terms of sort of mandatory kind of arrangements for your security, but there obviously was, after Joe Cox death, a similar debate to the one we're seeing today, and that has zoned in on the idea that we should be much more kind and respectful of our political opponents when we're discussing issues, and this is the kind of language and reflective kind of view we had after Joe Cox died. And I think kindness can take you so far, but maybe there's a bit further to go.
We're talking legislation here.
Well, Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister, has floated the idea, he said it's only an option, that maybe private security guards could be deployed at MPs' surgeries. Now, I personally think a lot of Kent MPs would recoil at that idea. So I don't think there'll be a lot of buy-in from MPs if it's on a voluntary basis. And I can't see the government introducing it as a compulsory requirement. So it might not go anywhere. But we're left with the position that MPs are incredibly vulnerable in certain circumstances.
I mean, Claire, obviously yourself and Karen both working with people out in the public in a similar way as to how MPs do, and they go to the surgeries and they speak to the people that have voted for them. I mean, does this make you feel any differently about working out in your community, for example?
I think you're always aware of the surroundings, you're aware of what the political climate is. I was discussing this with my husband at the weekend, that the 2019 election seemed one of the most toxic I can remember. And I've, lived through quite a few of these, but also the county elections of earlier this year, the mood has definitely changed. So I think you have to be mindful of that, but it's not going to stop me going out and speaking to the residents in my community, which is also where I live and where I've grown up, and I'm not going to hide away. And I think a lot of MPs also feel the same. They live in the constituency that they represent. These are their neighbours, their friends, their local business people. They have been there for some time and part of that community. So yes, you're mindful, but nobody wants to go to, a surgery to be surrounded by police if they're discussing quite a vulnerable issue, if they've come to you regarding housing or a benefits problem or a home office problem or, immigration. You don't want people to be frightened to come and meet their elected representative. You want to be as open and accessible as possible. But yes, you do have to look after your own security. And perhaps I wouldn't necessarily meet somebody now on my own, whereas I wouldn't have thought about it that much, before the awful events of Friday.
And I wonder how this has increased, people who are elected officials and public service workers think slightly differently because of the levels of abuse that have been put towards many of these people in the past kind of 10, 15 years. And again, I want to talk about social media because I think that's related to it too. But I noticed in the rolling news coverage today that one MP who was being interviewed used the phrase part and parcel of the job, which I don't know. I feel like, Karen, that seems like quite a shocking turn of phrase to say, well, you're an elected individual, therefore you may be subjected to horrendous abuse and death threats and whatnot.
I think if you receive a death threat, you'd go to the police, and I think the police do take that quite seriously. I think, we've got evidence of that. But I think there's a lower level of absolute toxicity that just permeates everything you do. And if you engage in social media, and I use social media a lot, it's part of my kind of method of keeping in contact with a lot of residents, you do get a lot of this coming through online and also by email. And to some extent, you have to develop a very thick skin. And then I think you have to say to yourself, well, exactly how thick does my skin have to be? Because, you eventually you feel like a walking target. But like Claire, I live in my community. I love my community. I want to be out and about. I want to meet people. I would take sort of precautions about being careful about who I met and where I met them, but I would do that anyway, to be quite honest, because there are all sorts of issues in society. But politics is becoming quite toxic. It's becoming quite nasty, and there's a horrible side to it, and that is really being driven by social media. And there don't seem to be any real checks and balances, and they need to be brought in. Actually, I think mail-communications as an act could be strengthened to look after politicians and public servants. We've got public servants now that are, doctors are under attack, midwives are under attack, and there's little point to doing that, really. You can be angry. You can be angry about the political system. You can be angry about what you see as injustice or people being badly treated or discriminated against. But obviously, when you take to, when you become violent, or when you become super aggressive, that doesn't take anybody anywhere. That's no good to society.
And as you say, there is a toxicity that I think we've all seen over the past few years, and a lot of that does end up existing on social media simply because that's the platform that we all have access to have conversations, to have debates, and of course a portion of that will be negative. But then when someone puts themselves out in a profile as a public figure, they are likely to attract that kind of abuse. It's an interesting thing to bring up as well, because a lot is often said about the theatricality of the House and watching each side kind of, especially the leaders, Keir Starmer going up against Boris Johnson, and there's a theatricality to that, and there's that kind of partisan politics comes in. I don't know, take this question to both of our councillors today on different sides of the coin there, that perhaps if the House is slightly less partisan in that way and tried to be a little bit more collaborative, would we see less division when people are talking about politics on their own social media channels? Karen, what do you think about that?
I doubt it, actually. I think we've reached a stage in politics and in contemporary society where there is a lot of anger that's being expressed, and I would defend people's right to also to be angry and be furious about what's happening. When you think about some of the things that are that are currently happening, it's right that people have the opportunity to be angry. What I would say is challenge the policy, not the person. Don't say things about people, say things about the policies that are coming forward. And we don't want a sort of dumbing down of politics. It needs to be robust. It needs to be. It's not going to change. It's not going to stop being adversarial. I think we kind of have to accept that. But we could have better behaviour. But what's going on in social media? I think it's a bit chicken and egg. What's driving this? Is social media and the lack of any sort of checks and balances there driving some of this toxic behaviour, which is then manifesting in some of these dreadful attacks. Stephen Timms was attacked. There's some terrible stuff that's going on. So we've got to grapple with this. And also, I think that there needs to be education amongst the public to say, please don't believe everything that you read about people, because people can post whatever they want. They don't have to provide any fact checking, and they can literally get away with saying anything that they like. And they can.
Yeah, and this is why organisations like Fact Check, for example, exist, because you can, as you say whatever you like on social media, and if that goes viral and lots of people share that or retweet it, then that can spread, and then all of a sudden there's a lot of misinformation that's out there in the wild. In regards to anonymity, which is something that Priti Patel has talked about today over the weekend, it's also something that Diane Abbott's talked about a lot, because she has received a lot of abuse on social media, and she openly talks about that a lot, and she's backing this idea for legislation that would force tech giants like Facebook and Twitter to reveal the identity of those people who have committed hate crimes on social media. But in terms of supporting an end to anonymity on social media, Claire, if that was possible, would you support it? I know you think maybe there'll be ways around it anyway. But if there was some way of saying, actually, you need to, for example, when you get yourself you want to get yourself the blue tick on Twitter, you have to give your driver's license or you have to give your passport. Would you kind of support the idea that actually everyone that uses a social media has to give that information to the tech giants to be able to access it?
Oh, this is a really tricky one because I'm generally sort of hands off with things like this, but there is a sort of merit to it. And especially when you look at most social media platforms have an age limit. And I suspect that we all know of somebody who is on a social media platform of any description who is not quite the age that the restrictions are meant for. So, you know, there is always a way around that. Would I support it? I think yes, but with the caveat that what are those tech giants going to do with those details? Now, that might be a little bit of suspicion for me, but if I had to give over my passport details, my driving license details to have a social media account, well, what are they doing with them? They aren't held in the UK. They're not bound by regulation in the UK. And we all know that our data does get sold. You know, you look at something on, popular social media channels and you'll see that replicated across other platforms because you've looked at one advert, they then suggest that you might like something else. You bought something, you might like something else. So I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that process. I'm also a little uncomfortable with, you know, the amount of legislation that would be needed to enforce that. And then you do go on to the enforcement issue is who holds the social media company liable? If they're not in the UK, how do we have jurisdiction? Do we have to go to America, to, you know, a Caribbean island somewhere, to Lithuania where servers are held? How do you get around that problem? So yes, I can see the merit, but no, I don't think it's necessarily the answer.
No, as you've said there, quite eloquently, it's quite murky and difficult and complicated to actually come up with an idea that would actually work in practice. But also worth mentioning to those watching as well that there are some positive sides to anonymity on social media, protecting people that are exposing repression, corruption, hate, maybe people that need to find support but can't and are worried that they will be seen on social media. So there are other positive sides to anonymity on social media that perhaps we don't always talk about. Worth kind of thinking about that. Very briefly, Karen, I mean, aside from the things we've already talked about, is there any other way you can see that we can protect our MPs who are out there in day to day doing surgeries and working with their constituents?
No, I think we have to have an open and honest and adult conversation in all our various communities about how we deal with this. I think we're entering into a hyper-bullying culture, just, you know, across the piece. I think people have lost the idea of being a little bit more careful and finessed about what they're saying, and they're just shooting from the hip and saying terrible things. And I think more fool of the people that believe that sometimes. And I think we've just got to carry on, and we've just got to do what we can do and look at where we can strengthen existing laws to give us more protection. And I, for one, will just carry on in my community as I have done. And I will challenge bullies. I will always challenge bullies.
Echoing what other MPs have said. Well, thank you to my three guests today. You've all been fantastic, and I think we've really got into this issue. You've been watching The Lowdown on KMTV and Kent Tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with another topic. Please do stay tuned, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye.